All right, perfect. So welcome everybody to our Lunch and Learn, teaching to everyone's potential, using neuroscience lessons to liberate learners. This is actually our last Lunch and Learn of the school year. Obviously it's June, but we won't pick back up until August. So last one for a little bit. My name is Olga Marable. I am the Director of Outreach for Fusion Academy. Those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a private school. There's about 70 locations nationwide, but 7 in the DMV. And so Fusion Academy is a revolutionary private middle and high school serving 6th through 12th grade, where positive relationships unlock academic potential. All courses are one-to-one. That means one student and one teacher per classroom. This allows teachers to customize curriculum and teaching for each student's individual strengths, interests, and learning styles. Our supportive campus environment is a unique space that includes a state-of-the-art recording studio, mixed media art studio, a homework cafe where students complete all homework before going home. Flexible scheduling lets students enroll at any time of the year and take classes at a time of day that works best for them. We also offer tutoring support, still in a one-to-one setting, and over 250 courses, and enrolling for summer credits right now, summer recovery, acceleration, and summer skills camps. We offer a fine balance between academic as well as social emotional support through the homework cafe, our clubs, and activities. And as I mentioned, we have 7 campuses in the DMV area. So that includes our DC campus, Loudoun, Reston, Tysons, Alexandria, Rockville, and Columbia. So a little bit of housekeeping before we jump into the presentation. As I mentioned, this is being recorded. If you want to turn your camera off, you're more than welcome to, but it is always nice to see everybody's faces. But this recording will be sent out to you most likely Monday. So you will have a copy of it. You're welcome to share it with friends, colleagues. Do please keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. We will have a Q&A at the end where you are welcome to take yourself off mute, but we don't want to distract the speaker, of course. Please rename yourself. You'll see your first and last name, an option to rename. So sometimes people share computers with their kids or their spouses. So if you could rename it to your first and last name, that way if you're asking a question, we can call you by the right name. The chat is going to remain open for the entire presentation. I do want you guys to utilize it to collaborate and network. Please feel free to be as engaged as you want to be. The presenter will not be moderating it, but I will be. So if you have a question for me directly, feel free to send it. I will answer you. And feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. I'm going to hold on to them until we get to the Q&A at the end. But when we get to the Q&A, please make sure that the questions are appropriate and not too personal, because this is going to go out to YouTube to the rest of the world when we're done. So I want to see who's here, a little bit of an icebreaker in a way. If you guys could utilize the chat, and I'm going to throw in the chat what I want you to say. I want you to include your name, your company and title, if you want to share that, your contact information, and what fun trip you're taking this summer. So I'll throw mine in because I cheated and was able to type it in advance, but I am taking my 5-year-old son and my will-be 3-year-old daughter at the time to Hershey Park. We're going to do a little weekend getaway. So I'm really excited to see how much fun they have. And I think they can ride a lot of the rides. Curious to see what else you guys are doing. Hi, Susanna. Monica, San Diego. I've never been. You're going home. That's awesome. Claudia, Boy Scout summer camping trip to North Carolina. That's fun too. I love hearing what people do over the summer, and it always makes me a little jealous because I feel like my summers aren't as fun. Puerto Rico, seriously? Man, Hershey Park is not that fun compared to Puerto Rico. That's really cool. Ginny, family trip to the beach. Love it. Hi, Nusha. Hi, Carmen. Rona, no trips planned yet. It's okay. We'll get there. And I just moved out of Gaithersburg, actually. We used to live in Gaithersburg a year and a half ago. So that's when we moved out to the middle of nowhere. Hi, Cynthia. Well, thanks you guys for sharing these extended family trip to VA. I really appreciate you guys sharing this. This is fun. It's fun to get to know you guys. I appreciate you sharing all your contact information as well, because we all can connect. Of course, they're doing lawn care as I'm talking. It seems like that's always the case. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to our speaker. I am going to let her introduce herself because I know she's going to give herself so much more justice than I ever can. And so I'm going to pass it over to you, Lane.
All right. Thank you, Olga. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Okay. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Well, thank you to Fusion Academy and Olga for inviting me to give this talk. I'm excited to see old friends both on the Virginia side of my work and the New Mexico side of my work. Welcome. And I'm excited to talk with you today about my book that came out this year, Teaching to Every Kid's Potential, Simple Neuroscience Lessons to Liberate Learners. And you'll notice in the title that I have kids crossed out and I've put in everyone's potential, because this book is 4 chapters, and it's 4 chapters about the way that we have fundamentally misunderstood ourselves as learners. And, no harm done, because it's taken a while for cognitive neuroscience to evolve so that we could measure ourselves in ways that we understand our inner workings a little bit better. And so while I may talk across examples across the lifespan, it's important that you understand that the things I'm talking about apply to humans in general, all of us, whether we're 9 or 90. And that the focal point of the book is to facilitate education, whether it's formal in a classroom, in a school setting, or informal, which is where most of us spend our time learning, especially as adults. So museums, art studios, parks, anything that you choose to do on your own that enhances your own learning and talent development. So we all have a nervous system, which is why this applies to everybody, but I will talk across the lifespan in specific examples along the way. Okay, so I'm an educational psychologist and a cognitive neuroscientist. I'm trained across psychology, education, and medicine. And I did that intentionally in my graduate training because I saw how many families and children would fall through the cracks. Kids who were incredibly talented but had dyslexia or ADHD or autism, and their teachers or professors were completely misunderstanding what they were seeing on the surface in their behavior. And the more that I started asking those questions of professionals, people would shrug their shoulders and say, we don't know much about this. And I thought, wow, look at all the creativity and the talent that is being squashed by good, well-intentioned efforts in education. So I committed to my graduate training to training across these disciplines so that, at least in my practice, I could speak on behalf of children and families. And I was in the neuroimaging community for over 15 years as a tenured professor at George Mason. I engineered the MRI laboratory there and was in the Department of Neurology at Georgetown for 2 years, and which is where a lot of my research on autism spectrum began. So now I'm in private practice completely, helping apply what I know from a scientific lens on behalf of individual children and families. So while you were busy deciding to register for this, I don't know if you had a chance to see the commercial, but I'd like to play it for you. This was produced in COVID pre-publication by the Arrowhead Indian Business Enterprise Center in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And this is kind of what I'm going to talk about in a nutshell. As an educational psychologist, I care about what features of the environment help promote or inhibit what somebody knows how to do. As a cognitive neuroscientist, I'm interested in the internal processes that make all that possible. But here's the irony. People are suffering in the name of education, and it's supposed to be the thing that makes everything better. So my book, follows certain paradoxes about how our brains learn and highlights certain biases that keep us from recognizing learning potential in our children. And so in my book, there are 5 key things that I'm going to teach you. I'm going to teach you to befriend distraction. I'm going to help you deepen the role you play in influencing the quality of learning that happens on your watch. I'm going to teach you to recognize the behaviors of executive function and how skills and abilities or disabilities might mask our opportunity to see the roots of those behaviors. And finally, I'm going to help you find a simpler way to identify and address those behaviors that stymie your best plans. If we want more evidence-based practice, we need more practice-based evidence. And my book is a blueprint to help make that possible and help that plan unfold. This book assembles great knowledge from science in service of the individual so that you can apply these strategies and make use of the insights in your own teaching and on your own behalf. Okay, so that's it in a nutshell. As an educational psychologist. Oops, nope, let's go back. Let's go forward. Okay, so my practice boils down to this basic principle. Science is the story of the grand mean or the group average. When you read a science paper about humans, a whole bunch of humans had to participate in that study so that we had ample statistical power to find out what we were curious about. And that's both a blessing and a curse on the individual level, because while you can take certain information based on statistical power from a scientific paper or a story or narrative that's in one particular paper, people are individuals, and all of the individual people that participate in those scientific studies, what falls away is the individual story, because you take the grand mean in science. And so what I do is I go back and forth between the grand mean of science, mining good information from science to apply on behalf of the families, kids, and organizations that I coach and evaluate. So these are covers of some of the publications that I've written throughout my career and where they are. I will tell you that on my website, there's a book section, and these are all in a list. And the ones that are available for free, you can just click and have the PDF. And then the other ones go to order information if you're interested in some of those chapters and stories. When I ran my laboratory, I was very interested in the relationship between talent and disability, because I've seen a lot of incredible things happen on an individual level when somebody is both bright and has a psychiatric or a learning difference. So that's what a lot of my scholarship is about, is mining in between those spaces of, I have this condition, but I'm really smart, and it allows me to do certain things supernaturally or really naturally, and other things I struggle with that most people find easy. And so how do I fit? How do I have my own productive learning journey? And so back to you as the individual, and thank you for being here today. What I'd like to do is challenge my audiences, because what we've done both in education and I think even with ourselves, especially in the pandemic, is we've taken ourselves out of the equation as, who are you as a learner? Who are you as a problem solver or a creator? And especially if you're in a support position, coaching children, families, or teams of any kind, you tend to take a step back and leave yourself out of it. You know, you are tending to the people that you're responsible for or the people that you're with. But what I want to encourage you to do is put yourself right back in the middle of that story and that moment, because your membership in the learning community that you are participating in is as important as everybody else's. And so throughout the time that I'm talking, if you can answer these questions for yourself and be introspective about these things, knowing these things in yourself is going to make you better at seeing them in other people. So I want to tell you a few stories. These are coaching stories and narratives that I use that come out of my research and my work with families and kids. This picture, it says, find an insight that heals. And that is an image from Richard Wagamese, who is an Ojibwe storyteller from my tribe. And dyslexia basically is like a webbed toe in the brain. And so there was a little girl that I worked with once upon a time, who was bright and bubbly, lit up every room she walked into. Only one day the lights went out because she was diagnosed with dyslexia. And her mom brought her in, and I spent some time with her. And while we were not making any headway in the storm clouds that were over this sunny little girl, I said to her one day, I said, do you know what? I said, the brain difference that causes dyslexia is in a piece of tissue about the size of your pinky fingernail. It's so small, and it's in such a specific part of your brain that really, on a brain tissue level, you've got these two pieces that typically live next door to each other. They're called gyrus. But in this case, a piece of the gyrus gets stuck together. And the lights went back on, and she said, oh, I have a webbed toe for a brain. And she started giggling. And I said, exactly. And her mom emailed me later and said, I don't know what you said to her, but the lights are back on. And thank you so much. And so I tell you this story because, there are arduous ways to coach learning, like language learning and development, things that require repetition and practice. But this information is also capable of creating those shifts immediately, like in a very tiny, subtle, effervescent way. Autism is just the sensory cortex trying to do the job of the whole brain. So this comes from my work directly in the neuroimaging world with autism. And the several studies that we did when I was at Georgetown and then collaborating from elsewhere, what you see in a brain with autism is that all the same regions and areas are there. It's just that when we are all born, we lead with our sensory cortex, right? Think of a brand new infant. All they do is receive input, swaddling, food, love, care. But that's all a sensory process in the beginning of all of our lives. And so with autism, that brain just tries to hang on to that experience a little bit longer. And the sensory cortex, as functions start to develop like into the frontal lobes and distribute across the cortex, an autistic brain says, the sensory cortex says, oh no, I can do that job. It doesn't need to go over there. I'll do it. And so what you get is the sensory cortex trying to do the job of the entire brain. And if you think about one of the presenting features of autism is sensory overload, right? Well, why is that? It's that way partly because the sensory cortex is trying to keep all of these functions back. And then if you have one part of the brain trying to do the job of the entire brain, those senses and information stack up, right? Kind of like Jack and the Beanstalk. So the stalk is narrow and it goes up. And of course, overload, that's what you see. And so I want the whole world to understand that all autism is the sensory cortex trying to do the job of the whole brain. And the fact that in the beginning of life, all it is that it holds these skills and these neural pathways. It hangs on to them just for a smidge longer, which means that when they finally develop and grow into other regions of the brain, they end up at slightly different addresses. And the functions also are slightly different based on the context of that whole brain. So that's all autism is, it's plain and simple. ADHD, I'm hyperactive, I'm inattentive, I'm distracted. Well, you're distracted because your brain is paying attention to everything, not just one thing. And inattention, it just means that you are distracted by your own imagination and your own thoughts. Physical hyperactivity, outward hyperactivity, you are stimulated by your environment. And the upside of that is that because your antennae are out there in ways that most people's aren't, you intellectually see connections among and between things that other people won't readily see. When I taught middle school, there was a teacher, veteran teacher, who said, you know, I just don't believe this whole twice exceptional thing. And then 6 months passed in her classroom, and she had a little boy who very smart, but very hyperactive. And she came to me at the end of the year and said, okay, all right, I get it. And she said, because this little boy, while I cannot get him to finish the diorama of King Tut's tomb, he elevates the discussion beyond any student I've ever taught in 30 years of teaching. So, okay, now I understand. And so what if the whole world conceptualized learning disability like this? Learning would take place differently. We would be living in a different place. And so the insights of learning, yes, we have curriculum and pedagogy and things that we have to do effortfully, but this information is also capable of shifting somebody's concept of themselves in an instant. And so the book really goes deeply into the development of the executive functions. And the executive functions live in the frontal lobes of our brain. There are 8 or 9 skills, and they're like confetti. They're all across the cortex. They're here, they're everywhere in between. And they don't fully mature until around the age of 25. And so if you're working with people under the age of 25, think of everything that happens in that space. People go to school, graduate, marry, go to war, drink, drive, vote, all these different things that we are entrusted with in our culture and in our society. And yet our frontal lobes aren't really there to lead the way until our mid-20s. Now, beyond the mid-20s, you think, okay, well, you know, is that the window of potential? Well, no, absolutely not, because executive functions can continue to develop throughout life, and they take on different nuances. In the adults I coach, we're often talking about planning. And in some of the elderly people that I've worked with, we talk about memory, and society talks about memory and aging as if we're losing something, but actually it's a story of trade, not loss. And so there's always something to be tending with the executive functions across our lifespan. But it's important to note that when we have people who are school aged and about the business of learning, that this is kind of the undercarriage, and this is where the action is for development. And so the way that I talk about executive functions, I don't like to talk with people about strengths and weaknesses, especially in children, because if these skills are not fully mature until the age of 25, how could it really fundamentally be a weakness? It's just a different developmental trajectory. And so the self-talk that we have as learners is really important. And as you know, pandemic has pretty much thrown a bowling ball into the learning process. All the pins are down, and we're just trying to figure out what to do. And so one of the first things to do is to understand ourselves, and that you know, we put ourselves under developmental expectations that are unrealistic sometimes, and we need to keep the trajectory going up. So if it's weak, it's a seedling skill, right? It's all upward potential. If it's a skill that somebody has naturally, then it's a natural strength. And the blind spot of a natural strength is if you do it naturally and without thinking, you assume everybody else can as well. And that isn't always the case. And that's the beauty of our individual differences, and where the coaching space gets a lot of fun. Okay, so these 4 chapters in this book, these 4 ways that we have misunderstood ourselves. When I was writing this, and Norton, my publisher Norton, we were back and forth about ways to conceptualize the book. And I said, you know, if a brain could talk, what would it tell us about how it wants to be developed, supported, and cared for? And as a neuroscientist and a psychologist and a teacher, these were the 4 things that kept resonating in my mind. A brain, to be optimal and to serve you through your life, needs to be flexible. It needs to be ready. It needs to be connected socially, and it needs to be unmasked, which means we need to understand behavior and figure out what the root, so that we can help that person in a moment. So here's a little more about these 4 big ideas. Flexibility is your ability to move between contexts and tasks. It's your ability to respond to surprising or unanticipated demands. It's your ability to give attention and emotional resources in the social environment, and your ability to respond appropriately to the moment, no matter what's happening around you. And so a flexible, adaptive brain that's what we need throughout our lifespan. And when we aren't flexible, that's where we run into issues. Readiness is being slightly more excited than scared about something that you're doing, because it's good to be a little nervous. It's good to have a little bit of stress, but there's a tipping point. And so readiness is knowing how to keep your body and your mind in a place where you can marshal your resources and do what you know how to do. Connection is exactly what it sounds like, being joined with somebody else, an experience of feeling close or connected to other people. And I can tell you that when we do things with our brain effortfully, we read, we write, we reason, that there are many ways that the brain can execute those skills. And the context is what determines what shows up neurologically to provide support. And when you are learning in the service of something greater than yourself, it shifts your whole neurology for the better. And I'll talk more about that as we go through the talk. And then masking is preventing something from being seen or noticed. And this is a universe unto itself, because we often misunderstand on the surface what's happening at the root. And the story that I like to tell is that ADHD, hyperactivity, can have 4 or 5 different roots. And if you don't figure out the right one, you're not going to be able to move that person forward. So you can have a clinical ADHD where your brain has low dopamine, but you might be sleep deprived. You may be emotionally upset or traumatized. You might be smart and really bored. Or you might be really allergic and be on too much corticosteroid inhalers. And these are all really different things, but unless you know which one of those is driving that outward behavior, you won't be able to be effective for that person. And so this is an example of what I was talking about in Find an Insight That Heals. So this is a slide from some of my scientific work. And on the top, you see, on the left-hand side, you see TD, and that's shorthand for typically developing children. And those were the children that were a part of this study at Georgetown. And then below it, you see ASD, and that's children that participated who had autism spectrum disorder. And these kids were roughly 10 to 17 years old. And when we put all of those individuals with autism spectrum into the scanner, and we looked at a part of their brain called the resting state. And the resting state is something that we all have. And if you can envision yourself adding and subtracting, 4 minus 2, 2, 5 plus 1, 6. So your brain does stuff. But underneath that system, there's another system that's kind of like the autonomic system, like your heart beats and the respiration of your lungs. You don't tell those processes to run in your body, they just keep you regulated. Well, the resting state of the brain is the autonomic state of your nervous system, and it serves the same function. It's a balancing, and it kind of percolates and functions in the background. And it's important because it's the place where imagination arises, where information that you've learned kind of shuffles and reconsolidates and ends up in different places, depending on the skills you're talking about or the skills you're working on. And so it's a very productive state of the brain that a lot of people don't realize that all of us have. And when we realize it, it can be harnessed for creativity, learning, and problem solving. And so back to this image, when you look at the TD image, and this is a brain from a side view, a brain from a front view, and a brain from the top down. And all of these different regions, they're all red because they are all connected in the same way. And this is the resting state in most people. Okay, what is the brain doing? Well, if we look on this slide of the brain, this slice over here on the right, so imagine that I've just kind of cut like a bread loaf. These outer activations, this is talk, this is language. Back here is your visual cortex and your sense of self, kind of perceiving where you are in space, in your context. And then this middle area in the frontal lobes is also monitoring and reasoning. And so moments where you're bored, moments where you're thinking, you're reflecting, moments where your mind is wandering and you're off task from what you should be doing, quote unquote, that's all resting state territory. Now notice that the ASD brain has red, blue, green, and purple activations. Well, all of those different colors mean that all of those different pieces are not a coherent system. They're all kind of functioning in their own space. Not that they're not functioning, but they aren't as well coordinated. And so this is a nice insight to be able to understand, number one, why the behavior we see in people on the spectrum, that they may not always be super coordinated. On the other hand, they might be incredibly precise about certain things. They're great visual editors and coders in the computer world, great artists, mathematicians, musicians. And so when a region is incredibly enriched in a person's brain, then that leads to some of those super skills that some people on the spectrum possess. But it also shows you kind of where their awkwardness comes from at times and why, especially in a complex social environment, they might not be able to keep pace and they might just overload because the sensory cortex is this green area up here, kind of on our crown. And so if that's the part of the brain trying to manage everything else, and then finally all these pieces kind of, fall in line, that has consequences for behavior. And so instead of being frustrated for the 20th time where you're trying to support somebody or coach them into a routine, or you have an expectation of what they're going to do and when they're going to do it, this tells you why that's such a hard thing to help someone manage when they're on the spectrum. So chapter 4 on unmasking, I pulled this quote in from Brian Herbert, who wrote the book Dune, and I love it because it reminds us kind of where we're all the same and then how our individual skills and capacities differentiate. So the capacity to learn is a gift. The ability to learn is a skill, and the willingness to learn is a choice. And the irony is that sometimes it's willingness that has to come first in order to unlock the capacities and the skill development. And so that's a big key to all of us as human beings with a nervous system. Our willingness unlocks the lion's share of what we can do. And so that's where we have to start, always, always. Okay. So dipping into some of the building blocks of flexibility. In that chapter, there are 3 big things that I talk about generally. We are learning in neuroscience that music and rhythm are incredibly important and supportive of neural development. A basic rhythm, think of a drum beat, can help coordinate attention in a classroom or in a group space. And I often put in the hands of teachers I'm working with, I give them shakers, or I have rattles, or something that sounds like a natural sound, the sound of the rain. And you can use those in many different ways. You can use it on yourself to just create a calming beat that's going to entrain your heartbeat and entrain your attention. And so what we're learning is that when people are regularly exposed to that kind of technique or environment, that attention systems become more robust, which means that your brain is more resistant to distraction and able to be flexible, but be flexible in the way that you can be focused and then responsive, focused again, and then responsive. Musical training also has a protective effect. Nina Kraus at Northwestern did a really beautiful study in 2013, and a bunch of high school kids for 2 years participated in an intervention where after school for several hours, they were either involved in athletic training or they were involved in musical training. And it's not to say that exercise isn't important, because that's also a good medicine for your brain. We know that in exercise, if you are physically active across your lifespan, the memory parts of your brain will not age at the same rate as the rest of your brain. So literally, physical activity, even in the form of short 10-minute walks at a time, confer an advantage to your brain and help preserve and protect your memory capacity. So exercise is important. But in this particular study, when they were having these kids participate in attention tasks and look at how flexible their brains were and resistant to distraction their brains were, the kids who had been consistently in musical training, their brains were outperforming kids who had just been exercising. So we know that music is a gift. We know that a musical soundtrack, concert, what does it do? It's capable of harnessing emotional response from large groups of people and putting those people on the same page and in the same space. That's very powerful. And so we are learning that not only is it a beautiful addition to life, but it's good medicine for our nervous systems. The third piece of building flexibility is play. And kids have license to play all the time, right? They learn to navigate surprise, novelty, social complexity. In the animal kingdom, play is used to develop skills in the pack and sparring and establishing order and interacting. And so, play is serious business, and it's something that all of us should be doing no matter how old we are. Okay, so acquiring experience and expertise in music, we are finding influences the development of other skills and even academic achievement. There are lots of studies going on right now in the cognitive and neurosciences to create and discover what the connections are. If I am musically active, it's going to help me with my verbal achievement. It's going to help me with my creative thinking and problem solving. And so, we're in the beginning of this enormous mapping exercise to show us how much medicine music gives us. Okay, so the second principle, being ready. Well, this was one of my favorite parts of the book because we have completely misunderstood the role of distraction, mind wandering, and procrastination. And this is where our self-talk needs serious revision, because distraction, mind wandering, and procrastination are where the resting state of our brain starts to kind of balance under the surface all of the busy things that we're doing. And in formal learning, we're often trying to get people not to be distracted. Focus, please stay on this page with me, in this moment with me, or with us as a group. Mind wandering, everybody's mind wanders. I am fully aware that in listening to me, you're going to miss chunks of what I say because you're thinking about your loved ones, about your to-do list, yourself, and that's very natural. That's your resting state kind of wafting in and out in this conversation. But what it's helping you do is integrate what you are listening to, and it's okay. So, when you think about coaching and learning environments and the amount of time spent trying to censor these behaviors out of the picture, we have to stop doing that because they're value added. And as adults, we're prone to procrastinate. We come by it honestly because we're all very busy. Pandemically, right? Pandemic has been an entire exercise in the sensory cortex for all of us. We had our structures, things that we depend on, those evaporated overnight. And all of a sudden, all of the different compartmentalized aspects of our lives fell on top of each other. And everybody was stressed. I think everybody is still stressed. It will take us a while to regain our footing. But procrastination, we often chide ourselves about this. And in the moments where we are procrastinating, we make it worse because our stress goes up. And the thing about our brains is a little bit of stress helps us stay on our A game, but a lot of it is stress. What's inside can't come out and what's outside can't come in. And so if while we're procrastinating, which is a good thing for the resting states of our brain, we're giving ourselves terrible self-talk, and so our stress and anxiety are going up, then we just, completely have squashed the opportunity in that procrastination. So I encourage you to speak differently to yourself when you're stuck on something, when you're just not ready to do something that your timeline or your schedule or someone, you're working with is expecting. And in those moments, you'd be better off to just recognize, oh, this is a resting state moment and something important is happening inside me that will facilitate my productivity. And if I don't stress about it, if I welcome it, have a cup of tea, take a 10-minute walk, read a book, do something completely different, and then come back, you're going to have a different experience. And in classrooms, this is a technique called spaced learning. And it means that you have this really intense direct instruction for 10 to 15 minutes. And then for 30 minutes following, you have whoever you're teaching do something completely different off task. And this is threatening in a school environment because school is predicated on the scope and sequence of a curriculum and what you get done in a day. But spaced learning has shown us, and there has been cognitive science research all over the world in third graders, in adults, and everything in between, showing that if you do that strategy with some precision, that it enhances memory development. So that's revolutionary, I think, because it suggests that we spend a little bit of time learning directly and then a lot of bit of time doing things that are life enhancing and then coming back. Picture the inchworm. You're going to go 15 minutes of direct instruction and then you're going to have a pause. Now apply this to adult life. This is more how we do learn and perform informally because life is so busy, right? You give your attention to something intensely for a small amount of time, and then life calls. You're a mom, you're a teacher, you're a coach, you have a big family, you have friends, you're connected to a lot of people. And so life kind of takes over, and then you come back to a project, and then life takes over again. And so this helps build flexibility. It harnesses distraction for good. And it shows us that our moments of mind wandering, distraction, and procrastination, that there's a lot of intellectual and creative power in those moments, and that we should let those happen. And our self-talk should be much different in those moments. So this is kind of a summary slide of readiness. And I borrowed this from YouTube. Somebody else had quantified this and talked about distraction and procrastination are thought to be the enemies of learning and achievement. And we've created a false dichotomy between pleasure and learning. And so we're losing a lot by differentiating and separating out learning from some of these messier processes neurally. Okay, so one of the other kind of myth busts in the book is something that I want to point out. Again, this applies to everybody, is that we think about the beginning of life and what's expected of us at the beginning of life. And it's basic compared to complexity of our lives as we mature. But I want to remind everybody, why is it that fairness and justice are so important? Well, they're important culturally and in a society, but they start out being valued from the very beginning of life because our brains love fairness. They love fairness, which is why we're so sensitive to it. When we are born at 8 months of age, 8-month-olds can pick up on inequities and imbalances of power. An 8-month-old can pick up on inconsistencies among people in a social environment and nonverbal cues. Most of us don't even have our words at 8 months of age. And so we are very smart in the beginning of life in ways that we need to remember that we're smart, because that kind of like keeping in mind that autism is just the sensory cortex trying to do everything. This is kind of a neutral way of understanding human talent and potential, and the sophisticated thinking that kids can be capable of, and the fact that as humans we're all wired to pick up on these kinds of things from the very beginning of life. Okay. So why is it important to reconsider mental health and learning? Well, I've been explaining all of these kind of tipping points in our thinking and how we are thinking about ourselves as learners. But this slide, you're between a rock and a hard place. And this is number one, why I say we have to put ourselves back in our learning communities first and think of that kind of positioning as an aspect of our self-care, because when we do that, it makes us better for everybody else. And so I want to talk a little bit about threat and about trauma. So I mentioned that when you're too stressed, when there's too much adrenaline in your system, what's inside can't come out and what's outside can't go in. And I've always conceptualized this as an adrenaline moat, right? Picture the part of your brain that receives memory input. It's called the hippocampus. It's shaped like a seahorse. And that hippocampus, it sits near the amygdala. So down here in this red arrowed brain, right here, it's kind of like right at your temple, but it's a few inches in. And that little piece generates a whole bunch of stress chemistry. And when there's too much, it floods your brain, literally creates that moat. And so what you can see from the schematic of the brain is that when you are relaxed and flexible and ready, your whole brain is connected. And so all of your coordination systems are ready to go. When you're too stressed or anxious, your brain gets, think of wringing the brain out like a washcloth. All that's left is that twisted washcloth and a bunch of stress hormones that lock everything up. Okay. So readiness is really on this left side of the curve. This is, this is a geeky term, the Yerke-Stotson curve, but it's how scientists define good stress versus bad stress. And if you're on this first part, if your performance is weak and your arousal or your attention is low, you're not really paying attention to anything. But as your interest or curiosity is piqued, your systems start to give a little bit of stress chemistry until you're right up here. This is like if you're a tennis player, you're on your toes getting ready to volley, like that's that readiness. You're on point. But beyond that, if you tip over, you go down the other side of the curve, and that's where you get too much stress. So one technique that I talk about in the book, this is to loosen the grip of anxiety, okay? And I came up with this talking with veterans. And I was working with a group, and I was trying to come up with a way, a physical way, to disrupt a post-traumatic response or the beginning of a post-traumatic response. And this is what I came up with. The amygdala of your brain, so in this schematic, it's yellow. It's about the size and shape of an almond. And so this piece is an almond over here, and it represents negative emotion. So I said, okay, imagine in your hand, and you can all do this, that you're holding an almond in your hand. Look at it. It's not bigger than you. You can hold it in the palm of your hand. And if you open and close your fingers around it a couple times, breathe while you're doing it, and then you say, aha, the piece of my brain and body causing me to feel this anxious and this stressed, I can hold it in the palm of my hand. It's not bigger than me. It's a part of me. And I can get on top of this. All right. And just that mindfulness helps stop that cycle of stress. Now, the second part of this is that you have this little blue area. It's called the nucleus accumbens. But notice that there's two of those to one amygdala. You have these each in both hemispheres of your brain. 2 to 1. The nucleus accumbens, I colored it blue because it's cool and it's like water. It provides calm and relief. It's what secretes dopamine, which is a calming chemical to your brain. It calms everything down, and other good neurochemistries. And so if you're in your left hand, hold 2 cherries or grapes. But if you're holding 2 cherries in your left hand and an almond in your right, and this can be an imagery exercise, or you could physically do this with almonds and cherries. You close your hand on the left. This is my good chemistry. This is the part of my brain that can help me rebalance. 2 cherries to 1 almond. There's a 2 to 1 ratio. The brain wants to be well, wants to balance, it wants to keep you focused. So in doing the visceral physical exercise of holding these analogies, these pieces that look and are about the size of these pieces of our brain, we start to understand that, okay, I've got twice as much good neurochemistry, regions devoted to that, as I do to the regions that are devoted to stress. 2 to 1, those are great odds. Then if I also tell myself, these are just parts of me, I can hold them in my hand. They're not bigger than me. They feel bigger than me, and they create internal feelings and states that feel overwhelming. But over time, reminding yourself of what your body and brain really have to offer you will help moments subside and disrupt anxiety. So I alluded to the good neurologies. Dopamine is one. And in readiness, I've been telling you that in order to be ready, you got to be motivated. You have to be on your toes, on point. Well, dopamine helps you do that because your adrenaline rises a little bit, but then dopamine also is secreted And that creates a chemical balance that keeps you ready, okay? The other piece of this is a segue into talking about connection, because oxytocin is what releases when to human touch. It's the chemical that bonds us to our families, our loved ones, and our communities. And in COVID, by the grace of God, I have been able to keep my doors open physically. I have seen people in person throughout the pandemic, never sick. And with kids, who starving for human contact, good moments. How do you celebrate good moments, right? Hugs, high fives. Well, early in the pandemic, we weren't sure, what was happening. And so what I always defer to is the pinky high five. And so even just the touch of a pinky, teeny tiny, that's enough to create an oxytocin response. And so that's what I've relied on with my kids and families in the pandemic, has been a pinky high five. And, hugs, hand holding, being physically proximate and comforted. That's the other piece of our internal medicine. And so we've got oxytocin and dopamine that are there to help us feel supported and ready, to keep adrenaline in its place, keep the stress response where it's good for us. And again, we've had a challenging few years. And so if you didn't know this going in, it was really hard to get a hold of yourself. But now I want to give you words, I want to give you exercises that will allow you to notice the next time there's a moment of overwhelm. I want you to have the knowledge that you have choices and that you have a way to re-situate yourself physically, mentally, and emotionally. So what happens when people connect in the service of something greater than themselves? So my story in the book, my example for this chapter, there are two. The historical example is Chaco Canyon in Arizona, in the Four Corners of the United States. Part of my work takes place in New Mexico. We're part of the Four Corners, the southeast corner of the Four Corners. And Chaco Canyon is a ruin that took over 8 generations of people to realize. And I've been there physically, and you stand there and it goes on for miles. You can only visit a smidge of it at a time. And if you imagine that what it would have been like to be a first generation inhabitant, this is a very remote part of the desert. It isn't very hospitable on the outside, not a lot of water or rain. And yet an entire civilization emerged there. And if you were first, you never got to see the fruit of your labor. You didn't, because it took 8 more generations to finish. So you think about the mindset of someone contributing to something that they will never see to maturity. Education is a lot like that too, right? Coaching, unless you are talking about a child that you rear throughout your life and support throughout your life, you may never see the investment that you make because it takes a long time for these things to mature. Now, the statue on the right, this is a little boy, Tino Sicueno Valentino Rivera. And Tino was a hoop dancer. And the hoop dance it's a medicine dance done in a group. And the Lightning Boy Foundation, children as young as 3 and as old as their early 20s dance this dance together. Boys and girls are not differentiated in competition. They compete against each other when they compete, but when they're not competing, they're all best friends. And they were the best example I could think of what happens when you are learning in the service of something greater than yourself. So I tell their story. Tino was a young boy who was injured in a car crash and sustained a traumatic brain injury. And he eventually passed from his injuries. But while he was here, his journey was back and forth from Poake Pueblo, an Indian pueblo in New Mexico, to Johns Hopkins Hospital, being cared for by a unit that was next door to the research folks that I always visited and worked with there. And so it's entirely possible that we would have crossed in the hallway and not known it. But this little boy's spirit is so big that it became this huge foundation. And these young children from many different tribes dance this dance together and promote healing throughout the world. Now, in a classroom sense, Northern New Mexico College is one of the places that I teach. And if you read my book, chapter 3, there are several strategies that I devised in my work with these students, because these are all adult students. They're coming in for education classes, but they are already teachers in classrooms. They already have families. They're living intergenerationally. There are multiple languages. Sometimes language facilitates and sometimes it's a barrier. But in all of those life realities, these people would show up to class and they, carry all the baggage that students typically do. I didn't do my homework. Oh, I forgot to read. I didn't have time to read. My child got sick, so there went my time. And what you always notice, and what I noticed, is that by carrying those conversations into the classroom, that further alienated them from their learning opportunity. And so one day I said, you know what? I said, instead of a quiz, I'm going to put you in groups. You were supposed to read chapters 1 through 4. Each group gets a chapter. You guys as a group are going to figure out what are the salient points from that chapter. If you were going to write a quiz for one of your classmates, what are the questions that need to be there? And so these 4 groups, they would do their diligence with these chapters. We would put their findings on the board. We would do a Socratic seminar and talk among ourselves. And at the end of it, I would say, all of you get 100%. Any of your classmates that didn't make it tonight, they're going to take your quiz as a makeup. And so they quickly realized that they didn't need to come in giving me excuses about the pace of their week, that they weren't going to be in trouble or penalized for what they did or didn't do. They understood that when they came to class, they were going to be supported by their classmates, and they were going to co-create and co-construct their understanding. And then they kept in mind that if I have to miss class next week, I'm going to be taking this quiz. And so that created a sense of community and belonging and relaxation that enhanced their learning over time. And all of those students, the minute we started doing it, my high school and middle school teachers right away started telling me, I'm doing this with my kids. I feel like I have a different class. And so I call it the reverse quiz. That's the strategy that I created. But it's kind of, if you're a teacher person, it's a jigsaw and a Socratic seminar tied together. And it takes all the best parts of learning, and it connected all of these folks into community, and it evaporated all of the bad self-talk and the stress and the excuses. I never got emails again. I didn't read. Can I take the quiz late? All of that chitter chatter just stopped, because they understood that there was a forgiving and life-enhancing way for everybody to learn. So why did I do this? Well, as a neuroscientist, one of the last experiments that I did in my lab was to look at how the brain functions in a hierarchy versus a network. And we knew going into the experiment, there was behavioral data that showed us that people working in a network were faster and more accurate than people working in a hierarchy. So let's unpack this, because a lot of us exist in hierarchies, right? You have a boss. There's a pecking order. You're a part of a team where a certain piece is expected of you to send forward. They're necessary. Both networks and hierarchies are important. It's what you do with them and how you function. So what we learned happens in the brain is that if you're in a hierarchy, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, but in the back of your mind, there's this self-talk. Am I doing it right? Is it going to be well received by my colleagues? Am I going to make my deadline? All of that uncertainty, which adds to our anxiety. And it turns out that what that does in the brain, it adds to the load. So the lateral part of our frontal lobes carries load, how hard something is to do. And so the brain in a hierarchy, all of the intellectual challenge, even if it's fun, is sitting on your working memory. It's sitting in the load part of your brain, which is heavy. So it makes you slightly less fast, and it makes you slightly less accurate because there's that distraction, there's that noise in the background. So if you're in a hierarchy, you need different self-talk. Okay, yes, I'm in a pecking order, but I'm going to have full confidence in my capacities and abilities, and I'm not going to worry so much about this. If you're at the top of a hierarchy, you're going to be sensitive to the fact that the people who are working with and for you are likely to have this mindset, and you are going to talk with them about it so that they are able to be more efficient and focused and less concerned and worried. Now, in a network, the brain loves to be in a network, because if you're in a network, you still have that piece of the pie. You still have the thing that you're doing. But if you run into something that you don't know, or you need more information, you don't say, oh, I should know that. You say, oh, I need to go get that. And you crawl out on the web. Is it a Google search? Is it calling a colleague or a friend? Hey, I need your advice, or I need your input. Can I bounce something off of you? It's just the freedom to do what you need to do to gain that information. And when we're working that way, the brain switches and it goes from load, how much am I carrying, to the parts of the frontal cortex that help us problem solve. And so we could have the same challenge in a hierarchy or a network, but different parts of our frontal cortex show up to help us problem solve depending on our self-talk and that context. And that's really important, because back to kind of how we treat procrastination and distraction, this is another moment where we have a tipping point in learning to be confident in what we know, to understand that we don't need to know everything, that we just need to know how or where to get the things we don't have or need. And that's much different than worrying in the background and having this low chatter or anxiety. You know, a lot of you probably have experience with working with learners that have anxiety, and the pandemic just elevated everybody's resting point in terms of anxiety. So this awareness is one of the ways to start to re-situate that. And chapter 3 has other strategies as well. Okay, so before I go to that slide, I want to give you one more strategy from the book. And this is to help silence that chatter that builds up and happens when we're doing something feverishly or under a moment of stress. So this one came from an adult retreat that I gave, and I was out with 7 people. We were hiking in the mountains, and it was a beautiful bluebird day. And yet one of these 6 or 7 people was chattering like the ticker tape on the stock exchange. You guys all know this because you've probably done it too, where you're just talking, no breath, right? You're just talking. And we stopped for a break, and she was still talking and talking and talking. And she stopped, and I said, the next thing that you say, at the end of that sentence, I want you to put the words "for now," period. And she kind of looked at me, and I repeated myself. And so the next thing that she said was something about her anxiety. And then she looked at me and she said, "for now." And I said, period. I said, this is when grammar is good for your mental health. That period is a full stop. right? It signals to your nervous system that there is a moment, that this is finite. This might be the state of things right now, but it's only for a moment and it will have an end. And anxiety tricks us, right? And trauma trick us into thinking that what we're experiencing is the be all and end all. And there's no way out. But if the next time you have a moment of overwhelm, you can put the words "for now" at the end of that sentence and punctuate it with a period, that's the beginning of a disruption of a state of mind that doesn't benefit or enhance you. It's the moment of pause. It's the moment you can give yourself without medicine. Sorry, I leaned. It's the moment that you can give yourself without medicine, that chance you need to catch yourself and say, oh, hey, wait a second. And so for now and almonds and cherries, those are the two very simple but powerful ways that I've discovered working in practice with adults of how to disrupt overwhelming anxiety and confusion. Okay, so I'm going to end here. And this is a provocative thought for you to consider. What really is the goal of education? You know, you might know if you read in the field that school was created in the industrial age to bring people in and ready them for factory work. But we haven't really undergone that much of a revolution since then. And yet our world is so much different. So much different. And now pandemically, even more, so much different. And so what really is the goal of education? Well, I assert that if you have a good education, you can respond appropriately no matter what you're faced with. You can experience and maintain that state of play and readiness, even when your surroundings are in chaos. You are buoyed by a social safety net. You know who has your back. You know where your anchors are. And you can advocate for yourself, even when the context isn't quite right, that unmasking piece. So I will end with the way to animate this and what I do in any particular moment is when someone's struggling, it boils down to two things. I, as a coach or a psychologist, I look at that person and I say, do they have the skill and the ability to do what's being asked of them? But there's something in the environment that isn't quite right. Or they don't have the knowledge or skill to do what's being asked of them, in which case it needs to be taught or trained. And so it's that very concise pivot. Do they know what to do, but they can't because of the context? Or do they not know what to do, in which case they need to be taught or trained? So in the world of executive function, you may hear the narrative that it might look like I won't do this, but it's really I can't do this. And that's another way to interpret that pivot, that when there's willfulness or stubbornness or resistance, that might be coming from a lack of knowledge or skill. And if it is, you know exactly what to do. Teach them how to do it, model, coach, encourage, support. But if they know how to do it, but there's something that isn't quite right, that's a different task. You're going to shift something in the environment to make it possible for them to be successful. And by the way, you could apply this to yourself. Do I know what to do here? Why can't I do what I'm supposed to do? And you figure out how to change the environment or shift. If you don't know how to do it, you're going to learn, right? Google, YouTube, call a friend or a colleague, go to class if it's something you're learning with a group. But it's that simple, A or B, very simple pivots. So I hope you will take these lessons and skills that are written into the book for teachers, but understand that this applies to all of us, and that the power of these findings in neuroscience, that we are a moment where we can readily apply these things, even though we're waiting on more neuroscience to tell us more about our brains. We have enough to work with where we can be impactful for ourselves and the people that we coach, guide, support, parent, treat. So thank you for your time. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
And there are 2 questions in the chat, so I want to go ahead and get started with those before we start asking more questions.
Mm-hmm.
First one is from Rona, and her question is the Mozart effect. Was it real or a scam? Please discuss music therapy in general.
Right. So I would say, so the Mozart effect in and of itself, that was a hopeful extrapolation of the data that drive that phenomenon. Is it going in the right direction? Yes, because knowing what we know now that we didn't know then, there is wisdom in the idea of the Mozart effect, that you're going to be, if you're exposed, it's priming your brain. And if we apply what we're learning about environmental support, there is wisdom in that. Where it kind of goes sideways is that kind of exposure is not deterministic at such a young age, or the headphones on the belly. It isn't deterministic. It will not guarantee a certain outcome. But from a priming point of view in the brain, and setting expectation and setting, a parameter in the environment, of course, it's important, because it's a way you provide early exposure, but it isn't deterministic. You won't get an A to B correlation or causation. And that's where we have to kind of wait for the science to catch up. So does that make sense? Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Next questions from Dan Campbell.
Mm-hmm.
Why is DBT less effective in teaching emotional regulation to people with ASD? As a psychotherapist, I see difficulty with emotional regulation interfering greatly with learning, especially the development of executive functioning.
Yeah. So think of it this way. Yes, I am familiar with DBT and have a lot of families that participate in DBT and CBT outside my practice. And the crux there for someone on the autism spectrum, emotion regulation is tricky, because there are multiple layers. You're dealing with probably low level, always present anxiety in somebody who's on the spectrum. And some of that is just the neurology of autism, but it's also learned. It's a learned behavior, or it's a learned state because of the unpredictability of the social environment. And when you're talking about emotional regulation, that's something that can be so overwhelming that an external reward or prompt, it isn't enough. Back to the idea that what's inside can't come out and what's outside can't come in. So DBT is an external influence. And unless that therapist has the skill to emotionally downregulate the person or people they're working with and bring them into a safe space, then that strategy slides. It's like, the Teflon pan, nothing sticks. So there are more steps required in working with emotional regulation and using that as a doorway into an executive functioning. And that's where we get lost. So kind of a nutshell, but Dan, if you want to talk about this more, give me a call. Okay.
Question. I know somebody else is doing it. Next questions, Rona. It's a really good one. Please discuss alternatives to medication for ADHD.
Yes. Okay. So medicine is not necessarily bad, but when someone takes medicine for ADHD, it's a way to chemically create that pause in the brain that I've been giving you mindfulness strategies to do. The medicine puts the system in a state where it can be more receptive. That being said, there are other strategies that you can use. I used to support college students with disabilities, and the kiddos that were hyperactive, most of them were in college athletics. And they did all of their studying and thought work at night because they go to a 3 or 4 hour athletic practice and they eat and they shower and then they are focused. And so what's happening there of the medicines that the body has, number one, they exercise. So all of the stress that builds up goes, because that's what physical exercise, it's one of the things it does for us. It gets rid of excess stress and stress chemistry in the body. Showering is a known strategy for dopamine release and creative thinking and relaxation. The flow of water initiates a neural response that is calming and focusing. And then they eat. And so their blood sugar's balanced, everything is imbalanced. So exercise routines are incredibly important for people with ADHD because that is the one way you can boost the body's dopamine is through exercise, because everything boosts our endorphins, our serotonin, all of the chemistry that makes us feel settled, focused, calm, and well can be elicited by physical exercise. So that's the medical alternative to ADHD, is use physical activity to form routines for thinking and problem solving. What else?
Those are all the questions I have in the chat, but if anybody else has additional questions, we do have a few minutes, so please feel free to take yourself off mute and go ahead and ask.
I think, Lane, one of the things that you didn't mention yet that has helped me so much as a teacher is the timers. And that has actually really helped me with students who have attention issues.
Okay, hi, Susanna. Good to see you today. So what Susanna is referencing is one of the strategies in chapter 1 is called the hourglass strategy. And it involves a series of small hourglass in 1, 3, 5, 10, 15, and 30-minute increments. And when I coach families, kids, and teachers, we've all been stuck pandemically, and we all get stuck in our own ways. And so how do you facilitate transitions without a power struggle? And I can tell you in the pandemic, probably the #1 transition that I've coached in families has been getting kids off of electronics to do chores, to rejoin the family, right? Our virtual worlds have just captured the imaginations of kids because the real world was so terrible. So how do you do that without a struggle and a fight? Well, you tip a half an hour timer and you say, all right, you've got half an hour left, but at the end of a half an hour, I want you to come set the table for supper. So let's say in the most stubborn cases, 30 minutes goes, they haven't disengaged. So instead of escalating the stress, you say, I can see you need a little more time. I'm going to tip 3 minutes. So in 3 minutes, you need to get yourself ready. And then let's say at the end of 3, there's 1. All right, 1 more minute. But at the end of this 1 minute, I need you to work with me. And most kids will shift, will begin to shift in that transaction because you are not pushing and pulling, you're not threatening, voices are not being raised. Everybody agrees that you're going to learn how to see time, and everybody has that external gauge. The other part of it is that timers, the ones that I recommend, they all have really pretty colored sand and they don't make any noise. And so, you know, if you're working with someone who's not neurotypical, or maybe even they are, but that bell goes off somewhere on your phone and it's disembodied, you don't know where it's coming from. If you've been really focused, it gives you a jolt, which gives you a jolt of adrenaline, which is not what you need right then. So I teach people how to see time, and that takes a lot of the sting out of these interactions. Susanna, you want to tell a story about your classroom and how you've used them in the classroom? Because you have a nice story.
Well, I have a whole year's worth of stories because I was lucky enough to start with you before I taught this year. But for me, one of the most amazing things is how it actually brought the onus onto the students. I mean, they became the ones who were in charge of the classroom. And I think you're probably thinking of the story I told you where I was really ready for rest time to be over. It's so excruciating for me, but we use a timer for it. And I went over and stopped rest time, and everybody who really was waiting for rest time to be over said, no, it's not time yet. I mean, they really learned how to not complain and not ask until the timer was up. And then everything exploded once that timer was up. But they also learned the colors of the 5-minute timer when I couldn't remember. I mean, they became so much more independent with those timers.
Yeah. So teaching kids to see time, teaching everybody to see time, either in a classroom or in your home, this is the kindest, most neutral way to enhance that skill of shifting. And shifting is one of the executive functions, and it sits in the bucket of emotional regulation. And so if you can get better at shifting, and maybe Dan Campbell, this will give you some thoughts too. If you get better at shifting using an external measure of time, where if it's tense, to learn to shift, there's an expectation, there's somebody waiting, somebody's asked you to do something that you don't like to do, and you're doing something you really love to do. That's a hard shift. It's a hard shift for all of us. So teaching people to see time using these hourglass is the best way that I can think of to build the emotional regulation skill, build flexibility for shifting, because we know from developmental science that when people are able to shift flexibly and comfortably and have that level of control, that it enhances intellectual achievement. So it's very basic, but it's fundamental to many other skills. And yeah, there are adults who have trouble with that. Autism spectrum, ADHD. I'm this individual, you're that individual. We crash at certain points. That's the beauty of individual differences, but this is a way to tend them a little bit more kindly and effectively. So, chapter 1.
Lane, thank you so much. Truly appreciate your time, your knowledge, all the information that you shared with us. Thank you, everyone who was able to join on a Friday. I know it's kind of like officially a summer Friday, so thank you for that. I appreciate it. And I will send this recording out to all of you by Monday. Have a wonderful, safe, relaxing, enjoyable summer. And I look forward to speaking with you guys and seeing you guys in the fall.
Okay, thank you, Olga. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you being here today.
Take care.
If I can help, let me know.